Hey guys, we're back again and we'll be continuing the story of Moses. But before we do that, just wanted to let you guys know that obviously we miss you and we can't wait for church to get back to normal. And we have some fun things planned. So I first want to start with a little bit of a recap of what's happened so far. So we've been doing Moses for a couple weeks now. And so originally Moses was not in Egypt. God called him to go and free the Israelites. So he goes in. He argues with Pharaoh for a little bit. A bunch of plagues hit Pharaoh and Egypt. And then eventually Pharaoh says, okay, you guys can leave. He lets them go, and then he changes his mind. And then he gets crushed by the Red Sea, and the Israelites get free. And so while this is happening, though, the Israelites have just been freed from Egypt, and they start complaining. And so this is kind of a theme that we'll trace a little bit, where anytime anything inconvenient happens, the Israelites immediately start complaining. And so then they start saying things that are kind of ridiculous, like, hey, Moses, did you just take us out of Egypt so you could, let us starve in the wilderness? And so then God starts sending them food. He sends them manna enough for one day. And so a lot of God's actions throughout this are to help build the faithfulness of the Israelites because they are struggling. And so when God gives them enough manna for one day, they have to trust that the next day he will also give them more manna. And so that's kind of where we pick up now. So the Israelites have now been in the wilderness for a little bit. They're exploring, looking for a new home. And so Moses is going to go up to the mountain and get the 10 Commandments. And so he goes up to the mountain and he's spending time with God. And before he leaves, he gives the Israelites strict instructions not to touch the mountain or to go up after him, because the presence of God is going to be with him. And this is something that's like pretty unique to these types of situations where the presence of God is always around us, but we don't physically see God, whereas like Moses is actually in the presence of God in a pretty unique way. So it's kind of cool, actually. But anyway, so the Israelites have to stay down in the mountain. And so Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments. And so the 10 Commandments' purpose is there's a couple of reasons. So it's to help us understand the Old Testament and some of the rules. It shows God's moral standards for his people. So the expectations that God has for the Israelites are laid out in the 10 Commandments. And it also points us to Jesus as the only one who could actually live as a perfect example of the 10 Commandments. Because obviously, I don't know how much you guys know about them already, but as we go through them, you'll find that we're just not able to completely live with these for our entire lives. Like, we make mistakes and we fall short of these 10 Commandments in a way that Jesus didn't. He lived them perfectly. So we're going to pick up in Exodus 20. And so as I recapped a little bit, the Israelites continue to move through the wilderness. Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he receives the 10 Commandments. And then God calls them to follow him and be a holy people. And so the first commandment is that you shall have no other gods before me. And this is not exclusive to just like the Israelites in Egypt had different gods. They had, a god of the sun, god of water, god of rain, god of, yada, yada. They just had tons of gods. And so the first instruction is you can't do that. Like no more building idols, no more praying to other gods, no more worshiping other gods. It's just me. And so kind of like piggybacking off that is the second commandment that says that you shall not worship any statues or figures of other gods, because God is the Lord your God alone, and he's a jealous God. The third one is you shall not use the Lord's name in vain or misuse the Lord's name. And so this is actually pretty common in our culture. You hear people saying this a lot, where they'll use the Lord's name in vain. Like, instead of saying, oh my gosh, they'll say like, oh my God, and they're not meaning it in a respectful way. And so God warns us not to do that, because we don't want to be using God's name in place of like a swear word. And then so number 4 is you shall remember the Sabbath. And they actually just kind of learned this when they were going through the wilderness and God was providing manna for them. The only day that they were allowed to collect more than one day's worth of food was the day before the Sabbath, so that they could rest on the Sabbath. And so this isn't just because God wants, he just he just wants you to follow some rules where you have to do this weird thing and you don't do anything on one day. But that even in creation, when God is creating the world, he rests on the seventh day. And this is partially to show our faithfulness. It's being able to trust God by resting one day a week, to just remember and be grateful for how faithful God has been to us in the past. And then number 5, this is every parent's favorite commandment. You shall honor your father and mother. And right now, every parent is saying, yeah, that's the most important one. Yeah. And number 6 is pretty self-explanatory. It says, do not murder. We shouldn't really have any problems, and hopefully nobody ever runs into any situations where this is the one that you break. 'Cause that's, pretty obvious. You shouldn't kill anybody. And number 7 is do not commit adultery. Remain faithful to your wife or husband. And this is also in a way of practicing faithfulness, because if you can't be faithful, to your husband or wife, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to be faithful to God. And so there's just consistency in your character there. Number 8 is do not steal. Again, this is pretty similar to number 6. You don't want to be stealing. It's hurting people. You're taking things that aren't yours. And number 9 is do not give false testimony against your neighbor, which is kind of a confusing way of wording it, but essentially it means don't lie to people, or don't lie about other people. Don't spread gossip. Don't intentionally deceive people, just because it's not a good representation of God. Because as Christians, we are made in the image of God, and so when other people see us, we are the representation of what being a Christian looks like, and so we're acting on behalf of Christ. So if we're lying and giving gossip about people, it doesn't make the impression of God on other people look well. And number 10, the final one, is do not covet your neighbor's house, wife, animals, belongings. Essentially, just don't be jealous of what other people have that you don't. And this is a pretty good summary of just learning to be content and grateful with what you have, and being able to trust God in your situation. Because what really you're saying when you say, hey, so-and-so has a toy that I want, or so-and-so has this or that, and then you're ungrateful with what you have, is that you're saying that God didn't provide enough for you, and that you wish you had somebody else's life. And that's actually kind of almost exactly what the Israelites were doing. They were saying, God, our situations are tough right now. We don't like them. We liked it better when we were back in Egypt and slaves. And so remember, the themes of that the Israelites follow are that they are pretty consistently unfaithful throughout their entire story, and God is consistently faithful and gives them more than they need and more than they deserve. And so the 10 Commandments, the first ones are kind of you shall nots. There's a couple that are you shall not do this, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not have any other gods, and then there's some you shalls. So you shall honor your father and mother, you shall remember the Sabbath. It's just an interesting switch up there. And then after that, he gives them some other rules about ceremonial things like altars, sacrifices, priests, tabernacles, things that we don't really do so much today, so we're not going to go super in depth into those, because I don't know if you guys have ever even seen a tabernacle. We'll get into that at a later date. But then the rest of the chapter, the Israelites get impatient with Moses for taking so long when Moses is literally spending time with God. They're unhappy that he is up there for so long. They're just kind of funny to see. And then as he's up there, the Israelites also make a golden calf. They do exactly, God says, hey, don't have any other gods before me. Don't worship any statues or figures. And they literally make a statue and figure of a calf while this is happening. It's pretty classic Israelites. Kind of sad. And so in summary, the Israelites are pretty notoriously unfaithful. They doubt God at essentially every turn. And the theme of the commandments is to teach them how to be faithful. They're mostly rules or helpful guidelines for us to be able to learn how to be faithful and to develop our character. Like, these are things that we should be practicing just to generally be better Christians, to have a better relationship with God, and also just to keep ourselves out of harm's way. They're not only just rules, they're also helpful for us to know. And they help to prevent us from making mistakes. So God's actually being pretty gracious in this. So as the Israelites are unfaithful, you might be frustrated with them, thinking that they just keep messing up, but we're very similar. I know it's easy to point the finger at them, but we do pretty much the same types of stuff as they do. So that is I think this is part 4 of the Israelites and Moses. And yeah, so there's a movie called The 10 Commandments, and I will send a link if I can find it on YouTube. If not, I'll just send like a description of it. That might be helpful to watch. It's pretty interesting. Or maybe look for VeggieTales. Yeah. Okay. Well, hope to see you guys soon, and miss ya. Bye.